Welcome to the Tough Decisions Daily Show with your hosts, Dan and Danae Hanford. As entrepreneurs and real estate investors, we are faced with tough decisions on a daily basis. These tough decisions can either make us or break us. On this show, you will hear from highly successful people sharing their stories behind tough decisions that they have had to make along their journey of success. In every episode, you will be able to learn from the thought processes behind the tough decisions that were made. Some of these decisions will have amazing outcomes and some not so much. So without further ado, your hosts, Dan and Danae.
On the podcast with us today is Jason Greenwood, calling in all the way from Auckland, New Zealand. He is an e-commerce manager for HealthPost based in Auckland. HealthPost is New Zealand's largest online retailer of natural health products, shipping to New Zealand as well as the world for over 30 years. Jason has worked in the digital space for over 15 years, both agency and merchant side. He is also a sought-after digital transformation consultant, public speaker, and content creator focused heavily on LinkedIn video most recently. Welcome to the podcast, Jason.
Thank you for having me. It's super exciting to be here. Yeah, and as you say, it's exciting to be calling in from Auckland.
Hi, Jason. Just wanted you to, first of all, kind of give us an idea of how you got into what you're doing right now and maybe a little bit more detail with your background.
Absolutely. As you mentioned, I guess, Dan, at the intro, which thank you very much. Appreciate the intro. Gives people, I guess, a little bit of color and context to how I came to be here. I have been in digital for over 15 years, and I originally started out actually in digital working for a web hosting company here in Auckland that was actually run by an American who had married a Kiwi, and he was living here in New Zealand, and he had started a web hosting company, and they also did web development, and they also had a CMS platform and a few other web platforms that they sold on a subscription basis. So it was actually a really, really super early version of kind of that SaaS model. And I had met the owner of the company through a mutual friend, and I was at a crossroads. I'd come out of hospitality. I'd worked in hospitality for a number of years and was sort of debating what my next move was. And he worked in the web space, and I obviously knew at that stage that was going to be massive. And this was around 2001, late 2001. And so I went to work for him, and I was effectively an account manager for the company, and also started to consult with customers around pay-per-click, because AdWords was obviously starting to get very, very big at this stage. We were also doing SEO, and we were doing some other, managed services work for customers at that stage. Still very, very early days of the internet. So actually most websites, the vast majority of them at that stage were, especially e-commerce websites, were 100% bespoke builds. So I was consulting even at that very, very early stage with clients to sort of, I guess, identify their needs and what they wanted to achieve online, and try to help them make that happen. And that was the very, very start of my career. And then very shortly after that, I realized, hey, I'm helping these guys build e-commerce businesses online, and some of them are doing very, very well. And at that point, myself and a business partner who was a very, very close friend of mine decided, hey, why don't we do this? Why don't we give this e-commerce thing a crack? And we did, and we started up a business actually while we both still had full-time jobs. So I was still working for this agency at the time, and I was just doing it in the evenings after work. We both had home offices, my business partner and I, and we started that in 2003. So we started a business called flashcards.co.nz, and which was the first e-commerce website in New Zealand that was dedicated to selling flash memory cards. And at this stage, flash memory was starting to just get very, very big. It was going into primarily cameras because there was no smartphones at this stage. So they were primarily going into cameras and audio recorders and the like. And memory was very, very expensive in this part of the world at the time. And something, 32 meg memory cards were selling for around $600 at that point, New Zealand dollars. So, and that's 32 megabyte, not gigabyte. So you can imagine the prices were just outrageous, and there was a real monopoly in this part of the world on memory cards. And so they were just, even though they were dropping in price in other parts of the world, particularly in the States, they weren't dropping in price here. And we saw a real business opportunity there. So we started up an e-commerce website. We jointly ran that. My business partner focused on the sourcing and contract side of the business, and I focused on the e-commerce side of the business. And within about 6-8 months of starting up, the business was so busy it needed one of us full-time in the business. So I quit my job first, and focused on the business full-time. We got office and warehouse space in Christchurch at that stage. And then in about another 3 months or 4 months after that, we needed both of us full-time in the business. It was growing that fast. So we went from $0 in revenue day one to just over 12 months, about 14 months, to nearly $1 million in revenue, annual revenue. So It was a wild ride, and we ran that business for over 7 years.
And what was it about that business that ended up, did you sell it? Did you close it down? Did it just kind of phase out because it wasn't a fad or a thing anymore? Or what was the background behind that?
It was a combination of a few things. One is we brought down memory prices. Our website single-handedly had the impact of bringing memory prices down in New Zealand by about 20% within about 6 months of launching. So we had a market-wide impact. And then a few years in, what started to happen is that as memory prices started to drop and as density started to climb, so as memory card sizes started to climb and prices started to drop, a lot of the major competitors in the computer shops, as well as the large electronics, home electronics resellers and retailers, they started to give away memory as part of bundles, typically with cameras and other devices. So they were throwing it in as a value add, and so the industry became really competitive in that point. It became very difficult to sell memory at a profit because everybody was giving it away. Oftentimes they were giving it away, or they were giving it away at an extreme discount if you bought it with, say, a DSLR camera or a digital video camera or something like that. So we saw changes in the market coming, and we did attempt to pivot. But when your name is flashcards.co.nz and that's what you've done for the first sort of 5 years of your business life, it's difficult to pivot. So we started to get into other home electronics and USB storage hard drives and USB battery sources and all sorts of other accessories for digital cameras. But it wasn't enough to, I guess, fill the revenue gap of our core product line, which was memory cards. So in the end, we decided to sell the business. We probably decided to sell about 2 years too late, to be honest. In hindsight, that was what we should have done. We should have sold 2 years earlier and would have probably made a lot of money out of the business. But we ended up selling for basically the value of the stock in the business because we didn't want to go into debt to continue to keep the business running. And so that's what we decided to do. We decided to sell it with no debt in the business at all. And we basically just decided to sell for, very small value for the goodwill and the brand and the company, and then the value of the stock that we had at that time, which was fairly significant, actually.
So obviously there was probably some tough decisions that you made in that business, but I also want to kind of focus on what you're doing now and how you're doing things now, because it seems like that business was sold back in 2010, correct?
That's right. That's
Okay.
correct. We sold that in very, very late 2010.
Okay. And so after that, you went from working for yourself, kind of doing your own entrepreneurial thing, to trying to make the decision of what are you going to do next. And so were there some tough decisions that you made in that process and that transition? Because I think you went to do some more W-2, what we would call W-2 work here in the States. I know you've been here in the States, so you probably know what I'm talking about when I say that, even though you're from New Zealand. But what were some of the decisions that you had to make in that transition? Because I can tell you right now that as an entrepreneur, it'd be very hard for me to go work for somebody else.
It was very, very difficult. It was difficult to make the decision to give up a company that I had helped found and build and run for over 7 years. And as you say, been my own boss for that period of time and learned a tremendous amount about myself, and I went into business with a friend. And, they always say, they warn you, don't go into business with a friend. But for me personally, it was the best experience of my life. We got along fantastically well. I think one of the reasons why we worked so well together was he stuck to his knitting and I stuck to mine. He wasn't a digital guy and I wasn't a sourcing guy. He had worked in the sourcing industry for a large two-way radio maker here in New Zealand, TD41. They export their products around the world. And he worked for sourcing manager for them for almost 10 years prior to us working together. So he stuck to his knitting. I stuck to my knitting, and we got along fantastically well as business partners and friends. And so it was a very, very tough decision to ultimately sell the business before we got into a situation where we would potentially have to go into debt to keep the business running. Very tough decision to do that. But we had always, right from day dot, my business partner actually financed us getting into the business. He had a fairly decent, I guess, cash reserve from his years working in sourcing. He'd done pretty well for himself. And he helped finance us, I guess, in those very, very early days. We were doubling revenue every single month. We needed to put not only what we were making out of the company back into the business, but a whole lot more to increase the amount of stock we were holding in our warehouse here in Auckland. That was a very fast period of growth. But at the end, when you make a decision, first of all, we had to make the decision together. We had to make the decision together jointly what we were going to do, given what was happening systemically in the market. And we tried a couple of pivots. They hadn't worked well enough to supplement or replace the revenue from memory cards. And so we had to make a very, very difficult decision. And we both knew we would never go into debt and we weren't going to leave suppliers hung out to dry. without being paid. Just ethically and morally, we weren't going to do that. So we did make the tough decision to sell the business. And then after that, it was a very tough decision. Do I want to go and do a different e-commerce play online, or have I kind of done my dash for now? And do I want to sort of broaden my horizons and learn a whole lot more from a whole lot of businesses and different, both B2C. I knew at that point that digital was my future. I knew absolutely that without question, I would stay in the digital space, but what did I do next? That was the question. And funnily enough, you rightly point out that, once you've owned your own business, it becomes tough. And it not only becomes tough for you to contemplate working for somebody else, but for someone else to contemplate having you work for them. I actually applied for 268 jobs before I actually got hired agency side again. And that was in large part because the vast majority of companies that I interviewed with, they just couldn't fathom someone who had owned their own business for as long as I had being, I guess, coachable, trainable, teachable, employable, being part of, I guess, a wider team. And that was really frustrating because I really did genuinely want to, I guess, get back into the digital space as I had been. But I wanted ideally to work agency side where I could be exposed to, B2C, B2B, B2G, and a whole lot of different pricing models and the way that they did things. And it did make a very, very difficult, trying time as I went about, I guess, applying, going through the interview process, and ultimately getting a job working for an e-commerce agency here in Auckland.
Wow, 268 applications. That's amazing. But you did obviously find a good spot and a good place for you. I was wondering if you can maybe go back and talk just a little bit about the decision to sell. And you had mentioned that you probably should have sold maybe 2 years earlier, a year and a half to 2 years earlier. What is it that you saw that was coming that made you consider that? And why did you wait? Kind of talk us through that decision a little bit, because that sounds like it was a hard one.
Yeah, it was a super tough decision. I guess one of the things that we saw, because we were doing a lot of sourcing of our product out of the United States, we're actually parallel importing from a lot of offshore retailers, including out of the United States, where the pricing was substantially lower, even at that stage, than what it was in New Zealand. And so we could parallel import in bulk from the largest retailers in the United States. And then we could add a fair margin on top of that and still make a pretty good profit selling to the market in New Zealand. And because we were warehousing and shipping directly to the consumer all over the country, there was no middleman. I mean, we were the only middleman in that entire transaction. And so, we had a very, very good business model. It was a very profitable business model, especially for the first 5 years or so. And I guess we saw some structural changes happening to the way memory was being sold in the States. And if we had, I guess, been more serious about watching those changes develop in the way that memory was being bundled, almost given away. It was a lost leader in many cases in the States for a lot of online stores. And, with the rise of, even then, we're starting to get into some of the smartphones. You're starting to get into micro SD cards, and we were starting to see that was the way smartphones were going to go, is they were going to have very, very small memory cards inside of them. And, once again, what was happening was the value add that even, smartphones, as they started to take off in the States, most of the major carriers were bundling their phones with very large memory cards. At that point, you could get, 6, 8 gig memory cards. And, that was starting to become the norm. And if we had, I guess, paid a little bit more attention to that structural change, and we could have probably sold the business to another company, perhaps that was already strong in a couple of other consumer electronics, segments or categories, then that would have probably complemented their business very, very well at that time. And to the point where we probably could have even sold to some of the major memory distributors. There was only a handful, there was only 2 or 3 master distributors of all the major memory brands in this country. And they didn't sell direct to the consumer because, of course, they would have been in competition with the retailers that they sold to. So I think it would have been a chance for them to own a retail brand that wouldn't have been would have been in competition with their other retailers, but they could have effectively had a retail channel, direct to consumer retail channel via our business had we pursued that early on enough, while I guess the margins, and it wasn't so much just the margins. You have to remember that memory went from sort of $650 for a 32 and then 64 megabyte memory cards, all the way down to where, you could get multiple gigabyte memory cards for $20, $30, $40, $50. So, and even if your margins are the same, so let's say you have 50% margin on a memory card. Well, 50% margin on $650 is not the same dollar margin as on a $50 memory card. So that was the other structural change that is really important to remember, is that your average margin might stay the same, but if your ASPs, i.e. your average selling price, is falling really, really rapidly, then the actual dollar margin that you take home falls. And so you have to understand those structural changes as well. And you also have to understand the structural changes, particularly when you're in a fast-moving consumer goods market like memory. You also have to understand the changes in exchange rates during that time, because you can all of a sudden find yourself underwater if the exchange rates are moving very rapidly and also densities are going up on those memory cards. Then you have to churn your stock very, very quickly. Otherwise, you can get caught with your pants down, both in terms of holding older density cards, and they may have gone from, say, 2 gig to 8 gig as the most popular size. And then all of a sudden, if you get caught with a bunch of 2 gig cards and at an unfavorable exchange rate, you can be underwater very, very quickly on your goods. So those are a couple of the things that I learned to watch for throughout the lifespan of our business. But ultimately, we would have had a lot more options had we tried to sell the business a couple of years prior. We had a lot more options in terms of potential buyers of the business. And I think that's ultimately the key.
Right now, I know you're working as an employee for somebody else, but you also are doing some of your own entrepreneurial stuff at the same time, correct?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, I think that, most of the people that I know that work in digital, they've got various side hustles at all times, right? They're always doing something to keep their mind engaged, I guess, to keep learning as well, and to be able to keep sharing the knowledge that they've built up over their career, and to, give them opportunities and alternatives outside of their day job, so to speak. And I do love what I do. I work for, I've been into natural health my whole life. So I was able to kind of pick up a role where I married two extreme passions. One is the passion for digital and e-commerce, and the other passion is for natural health. And I kind of get to combine those two passions in the one role, working for HealthPost. It's a family-owned company. It is, as you pointed out, the largest online retailer of natural health products in New Zealand. And it's a great company to work for. I get to work on some very exciting, very large-scale projects for the business. And we've got over 100 staff split between two locations, one in Auckland, one down in Collingwood in the South Island, which is basically all of our internal logistics and operations are down in the South Island. So it is a great opportunity, but I also still have, quite a lot of demand for my knowledge, my experience, and my services in the digital space too. So I get to fill that need by being able to consult with businesses and individuals on their digital business. That's the digital side of their business, or if they're a pure play, they're pretty much all of their business. So it keeps me engaged, and I get to exercise, those entrepreneurial tendencies or those entrepreneurial drive. I get to exercise that in addition to my day job, which is super exciting.
So, Jason, you've obviously had quite a bit of experience making, daily decisions for a business, as well as some, maybe very large, tough decisions. So tell us what you do when you are facing a tough decision.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing, and this is easier said than done, I think one of the things that I try to do is to try to take the emotion out of the decision. I try to imagine if I was giving consulting advice to someone else in exactly the same situation that I was in, what would the advice be? Because then you can see it through less emotional eyes. If you imagine that you were the client and then you were consulting to that client in that same tough situation, what would your advice be? And that, to me, is probably the easiest way to start taking emotion out of the decision and kind of make it on the cold, hard facts. And that's difficult. Certainly when you own a business and you've put blood, sweat, and tears in it for multiple years, that becomes harder and harder to do the more aligned you are as an individual and as an emotional human being. When you've got a lot of that self-worth tapped up and your ability to be a good business person, that becomes easier said than done. But that's certainly the approach that I've always tried to take is, hey, look, if I was giving this advice to someone else, what would that advice look like? What would be the best advice I could possibly give them? And that's probably the advice I'd give to your audience that might make it a little bit easier for them to take the emotion out of the decision.
Danae, what was that quote that Gino Barbaro on episode 6 talked about? Because I kind of think that kind of coincides with the same kind of topic, does it not?
Somewhat. He said you sell yourself with emotion, but you close yourself with logic. So whenever you're facing a decision, you want, especially I guess when you're choosing a future path, you want it to be something that you are passionate about. And so you have that emotion, but there also has to be the logic behind the decision as well. It has to make sense for the situation that you're in. And I was just going to say that, I think removing yourself and trying to remove some of the emotion is important for entrepreneurs, because especially when you're dealing with a business that you've put your blood, sweat, and tears in, it can be an emotional thing. There can be that emotional attachment to that, but that can prevent you from making the best decision if you let that drive you totally. You have to be able to remove yourself from that. So I think that's great advice. Jason, do you have a book that you would recommend to our listeners that has helped you in the way that you make decisions?
Yeah, I think there's two books that have an entrepreneurial, overlap. One is E-Myth Revisited, which really started to get me to think, even in my own business, because I actually read that book when I already owned my own business. And that really started to help us to codify internally and document all of our business processes to where if something happened to myself or my co-founder and we were to get hit by a bus or something like that, could the business carry on without us? Or would it be so dependent on the IP in our heads that the business couldn't function? And we never wanted to put our business under that kind of risk profile. So I guess we wanted to de-risk that by documenting kind of the processes and logic behind every single major function that we did in the business operationally. And so that could actually be offloaded to other people. And I think that was an important thing for us to learn through reading that book. And then the other book that has been probably the most powerful for me as an entrepreneur is Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. And people have mixed feelings on Ayn Rand, but I think Atlas Shrugged is really, it does speak to the entrepreneurial spirit. It speaks to the entrepreneurial mindset. It speaks to the ability for people to see opportunities in the market that, where you don't have to rely on a government, you don't have to rely on another human being. You see opportunities in the market to make a new market or to make an existing market significantly better through effectively your craft, your art. Those two. And then the final one, I think that has been very powerful for me is Linchpin by Seth Godin. Those three are probably the three biggest ones for me. And the one from Seth Godin is really critical, I think, for entrepreneurs that find themselves in a position of being back in the workplace like I did. And for me, the best thing about that is that you can exercise all of your entrepreneurial passion. You can exercise all of the knowledge and skill that you've built up as an entrepreneur as a linchpin within another organization. And I think that helped me to understand this isn't the end. This is really the beginning of the next chapter of my life. And it can feel like a death in the family, whether you sell your business, profitably or unprofitably, however ultimately a business winds up. It can feel like a death in the family because it does feel like a family member that's been with you for years. So I think for me, the ability to be a linchpin, and I definitely consider myself, and I try hard every single day to be a linchpin at HealthPost and to bring all of my many years of experience, both as an entrepreneur and as an employee. I basically try to bring my best self to work every single day and to be that indispensable linchpin that hopefully adds value far and beyond, what a salary could ever kind of pay you for.
So what's the most exciting place you have traveled or item that you have purchased with the money that you've made up to this point as an entrepreneur?
That's a tough one. I've been to quite a few places. Certainly, I spent in 1998, I actually spent 3 months traveling around Australia. And Australia is actually an amazing place. I've got family that actually live there now. My mom, my sister, my brother-in-law, my two nephews actually live in Brisbane now. But back in 98, I tell you, it wasn't quite as touristy as it is today. I traveled there with 3 German mates, and we actually traveled by car, and we did over 20,000 K by car in 3 months, and we went all the way up and down the entire East Coast. So we started out in Sydney and then went as far north as Daintree and Cape Tribulation and came back down through the middle of the country, and it was truly spectacular. It's they call it the lucky country, and I can see why. It's got such a wide variety of cultures and landscapes and I guess opportunities to do really truly unique things in a unique environment. So Australia would be probably right up there near the top.
And what is the number one item on your bucket list right now that you want to do?
Man, that's an interesting one. I guess for me, I want to right now. So I have a vision of creating a mobile, a converged retail app. From a business perspective, I guess what's on my bucket list is creating an application that actually changes the game of digital and retail forever. And there's a big gap, I think, in retail today. In my experience, there is a massive, massive gap between the online experience and the in-store experience for omni-channel businesses. And so they might even have a fantastic online experience. They might be killing it on social. They might be, from a pure digital, pure play perspective, they might be sort of ticking every box, but the in-store experience dramatically lags in almost every one of those situations. And I have a vision for building an app that completely converges those two experiences, augmented with augmented reality as well. That brings it would allow you to gamify the in-store experience. It would allow you to bring a lot of the the technology and the experiential stuff that you can do online also in store. And it would make those experiences much, much more similar than they are today. And so that's definitely on my bucket list, is to bring something brand new from an experiential perspective to the industry, to the digital space, that I've seen a gap in the space for a very long time. And I want to help fill that gap and have a drop-in solution for omni-channel businesses that they really, really lack today. And so that's definitely on my bucket list to do.
And Jason, how can the listeners reach out to you if after listening to the podcast, they want to, get some more information from you or start to follow you some more?
Yeah, absolutely. So they can catch up with me on LinkedIn. That's probably, as you pointed out in the first start of the podcast, that's a place where I'm devoting a ton of my time now. Now that native video has come to LinkedIn, and I'm seeing just sky high engagement levels on LinkedIn. Fantastic place. They can follow me there. I'm on all the major social platforms as well. I've got a YouTube channel that I put a lot of content out on. A lot of content out on Facebook as well. I've got my own Facebook profile there, page, public profile page there. I'm heavily involved in Instagram as well, and a little bit on Twitter. But really, it's primarily it's LinkedIn, it's YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Those four.
Well, Jason, I really do appreciate you taking some time out of your schedule to be with us today, all the way from New Zealand on the podcast today. Thank you so much for joining us, and I wish you the very best.
Thank you very much, guys. Really, I've enjoyed being with you, and maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Absolutely, we'd love to.
Cheers, guys. Have a great day.
Do you want to nominate a highly successful entrepreneur or real estate investor to be a guest on this show? Email us at dan@toughdecisions.net. Help us by spreading the word about our show with your friends. And also take time right now to subscribe and leave a review on iTunes, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, or your favorite platform. You've been listening to The Tough Decisions Show.